All right, today we are diving into one of the biggest financial stories happening right now, the massive surge of investment into so-called emerging markets. It's a story of incredible returns, but as you'll see, it's also a story with some really deep and pretty complicated roots.
Okay, so let's jump right in with what's going on in the markets today. Why is absolutely everyone, from wealth managers to the biggest institutional investors, suddenly so laser-focused on emerging economies? For the longest time, investing in these markets was kind of seen as, well, a tactical side bet, right? A little bit of extra spice for your portfolio. But that is all changing. We're talking about a fundamental reordering of global growth, where these markets are moving from the sidelines to become a central force in the world economy.
And this is the number that's got everybody's attention. 15%. That's the year-to-date return for local currency government bonds in emerging markets. In a world where every little fraction of a percent matters, a return like that, it's just massive.
And context here is everything, right? That 15% isn't just a big number floating out there on its own. Just look at this chart. It's more than double the return from U.S. high-yield corporate bonds, and it absolutely dwarfs what you'd get from U.S. treasuries. So yeah, you can see why investors are getting so excited.
And this quote from a chief investment officer at Neuberger Berman, it just nails it. It perfectly captures this whole shift. People aren't seeing this as some temporary trend anymore. Nope, they're seeing it as a core structural change in how you build a resilient global investment portfolio for the long haul.
Okay, but wait a second. We've been throwing this term around, emerging, like it's just some simple, straightforward financial category. But is it, really? Where does that language even come from?
So let's hit pause on the finance for just a minute and ask a much deeper question. Because honestly, to really get what's happening now, we have to look at how we got here. And that means we need to take a hard look at the very idea of development itself.
See, this whole idea of a market emerging, it's built on this really powerful and, let's be honest, pretty controversial historical concept from political theory. It's called developmentalism.
And this is the core idea right here. Developmentalism is basically the belief that every single society is on the exact same single path, moving through these predictable stages of history. And in this model, guess who's at the top? Western nations were positioned as being at the final, most advanced stage of that path.
And this slide does a fantastic job of showing the two sides of that coin. On one hand, you've got this neat and tidy theory about universal progress. Sounds great, right? But on the other hand, you have the much darker reality. It was a framework that was used to create a global hierarchy. It basically took cultural and economic differences and relabeled them as backwardness, which then, of course, provided a really powerful justification for colonial rule.
This quote from the political theorist David Meyer Temin is just, wow. It's incredibly sharp. He says the language of development wasn't neutral at all. He calls it an ideological weapon. It created this so-called obligation for advanced societies to rule over, to civilize, and to save the supposedly backward ones.
But here's the thing. This idea wasn't just passively accepted by the people it was used against. No way. Far from it. This whole framework was actively and powerfully contested. Thinkers and activists, people like the Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney, they completely flipped the script. Their argument was that Western imperialism hadn't helped these societies develop at all. In fact, it had actively underdeveloped them, basically knocking them off their own unique historical paths. So for them, real development meant throwing out the Western model and putting the power directly into the hands of the people to forge their own future.
Okay, so with that really important historical context in our back pocket, let's bring it all back to the financial markets today. What's the modern investment case? Why are investors pouring so much money into these markets right now?
Well, first off, it's about sheer, undeniable scale. Look at this. Emerging markets are home to the vast majority of the world's population and make up almost 60% of global GDP. So we're not talking about some niche corner of the global economy. In a lot of ways, this is the global economy.
In the modern financial logic, it's crystal clear. Investors are hunting for a macro growth premium, that extra growth that's getting harder and harder to find in developed markets. They also really want to diversify away from portfolios that are super concentrated in just a few U.S. tech giants. Investing here gives them exposure to completely different sectors. We're talking materials, industrials, financials, the very stuff that's tied directly to global trade and domestic growth. So this brings us to a fascinating point. We have two completely different ways of looking at this global shift. On one hand, you've got the historical frame we just talked about, which sees the language of development as an ideological weapon. And then on the other hand, you have today's purely financial frame,
It's a language of diversification, of growth premiums, and portfolio balance. I mean, these are two starkly different stories being told about the exact same global dynamic.
So what are we supposed to make of all this? How do we square the financial boom of today with these complex historical echoes of the past?
And that brings us to our final, and I think central question. Is this massive surge of investment a sign that we're finally seeing a genuine rebalancing of the global economy? Or is it just a new chapter in a very old story, just dressed up in the modern language of portfolios and returns? That's definitely a question worth thinking about.